In the brutal winter of 1878, a human life was worth less than a bottle of cheap whiskey. When a scarred mountain man threw 3 crumpled dollar bills onto an auction block to buy a bruised captive girl, the town mocked him. They didn't know those $3 would ignite a blood-soaked war and birth the greatest ranching empire in the Wyoming Territory. The wind howling through South Pass City felt like broken glass against the skin. It was a dying gold rush town, a purgatory of mud-frozen horse manure and desperate men. Gideon Hayes, a man who looked as though he had been carved directly from the granite of the Wind River Mountains, pulled his buffalo hide collar tight against his jaw. Gideon was a ghost to the townsfolk. He only descended from his sprawling, isolated ranch in Ironwood Basin twice a year for salt coffee and ammunition. He spoke to no one, and no one dared speak to him. Standing at 6'4", with cold storm-grey eyes and a jagged scar tearing through his beard, a souvenir from a grizzly bear that hadn't survived the encounter, Gideon was a violent force of nature wrapped in a frayed wool coat. But on this bleak November afternoon, his routine was shattered by a sound that made his blood run cold, the rhythmic, indifferent chanting of an auctioneer. Gideon steered his draft horse toward the alleyway, behind the Red Lantern Saloon. A crowd of drunken miners, railroad thugs, and drifters had gathered in the freezing sleet. On a makeshift wooden platform, constructed from whiskey crates, stood Josiah Miller, a trafficker whose soul was as black as the coal dust staining his teeth. Josiah was liquidating assets from a recently collapsed railroad camp. Gideon watched from the shadows as men bid on stolen draft horses and crates of stolen dynamite. Then Josiah dragged something else onto the block. It was a girl. She was Chinese, though her delicate features were obscured by soot bruises and sheer exhaustion. She was shivering violently, wearing nothing but a thin, torn cotton dress and a burlap sack draped over her frail shoulders. Her wrists were bound with coarse hemp rope that had rubbed her skin raw. The crowd erupted into vile laughter and jeers. Josiah yanked her forward by the hair. "Got a broken one here, boys," Josiah bellowed over the wind. "Railroad camp cast off. She's sick, ain't got much meat on her bones, and don't speak a lick of English. But she can scrub floors, wash clothes, or whatever else you lonely bastards need. Bidding starts at $5. Silence fell over the alley. The men looked at her with a mixture of disgust and dark, predatory intent. No one spoke. The girl kept her eyes fixed firmly on the frozen mud, refusing to look at her tormentors. Despite her visible trembling, Gideon noticed something striking her jaw was set. She wasn't crying. She was terrified, but she was entirely unbroken. "Come on," Josiah spat. $4. From the front of the crowd, Jeb Stone, the hulking, grease-stained owner of the local brothel, chewed on a cigar and grinned. "She looks like she's got the consumption, Josiah. She'll be dead by Tuesday. I'll give you $2. I can use her to muck out the stables out back until she drops." Josiah sighed, raising his wooden gavel. $2 to Jeb. Going once. Going twi. 3. The single word cut through the howling wind like a rifle shot. The crowd parted instantly as Gideon Hayes stepped out of the shadows. The sheer mass of the mountain man, combined with the heavy Colt revolver strapped to his thigh, drained the bravado from the onlookers. Jeb Stone's smile vanished. "Hayes, this ain't your business. Go back to your mountain." Gideon didn't look at Jeb. He didn't look at Josiah. He walked straight to the wooden platform, reached into his heavy coat, and pulled out 3 crumpled, grease-stained dollar bills. He dropped them onto the wood at Josiah's boots. $3. Gideon repeated his voice, a low, gravelly rumble that offered no room for negotiation. Josiah swallowed hard, looking from the money to Gideon's dead grey eyes. He didn't dare strike the gavel. "Sold," Josiah muttered, quickly scooping up the bills. Gideon drew a hunting knife from his belt. The crowd gasped, stepping back, anticipating bloodshed. Instead, Gideon reached the girl, took her bound hands, and effortlessly sliced through the thick hemp rope. The girl flinched finally, looking up at him. Her dark eyes were wide, expecting a blow. Gideon didn't touch her. He stepped back, holstered his knife, and unbuttoned his massive buffalo hide coat, slipping it off his shoulders. He wrapped the heavy, warm fur around her shivering frame. It dwarfed her, dragging in the mud, but the immediate warmth made her gasp. "Can you walk?" Gideon asked. She stared at him, bewildered, pulling the coat tighter around herself. She gave a faint, hesitant nod. "Then walk behind me. Keep close." As Gideon turned to lead her away, Jeb Stone stepped into his path, his hand resting on the handle of a rusty revolver tucked into his belt. "You think you're a hero, Hayes? You just bought a corpse. When she dies on your floor, don't bring her back here." Gideon paused. He didn't raise his voice, but the menace in his tone made the hair on the back of Jeb's neck stand up. "If you ever step within 10 miles of Ironwood Basin, Jeb, they won't find enough of you to bury." Jeb stepped aside. Gideon walked to his horse, lifted the girl effortlessly by her waist, and set her onto the saddle. He took the reins and began the long, treacherous walk out of South Pass City, leaving the stunned crowd behind in the sleet. The journey up to Ironwood Basin was a grueling 4-hour ascent. By the time they reached the tree line, the sleet had transformed into a blinding whiteout blizzard. Gideon trudged through knee-deep snow, pulling the horse by the reins while the girl clung to the saddle horn, completely buried within his massive coat. Gideon's mind was a storm of its own. He was a solitary man for a reason. 10 years ago he had a wife and a son. Cholera took them both in a matter of days on the Oregon Trail. Since then, Gideon had carved out his territory in the mountains, building a thriving cattle ranch entirely alone, punishing himself with isolation and back-breaking labor. He didn't want company. He didn't want responsibility. But looking at the girl on the auction block, he had seen the same helpless terror his wife had in her final hours. He couldn't walk away. Through the roaring wind, the dark silhouette of Gideon's cabin emerged. It wasn't a shack. It was a fortress. Built from massive hand-hewn pine logs, it sat at the center of a valley, shielded by towering peaks. Massive barns and corrals stretched out behind it, housing hundreds of head of cattle. Gideon carried the girl inside. The cabin was freezing but dry. He immediately set to work, striking a match and lighting the oil lamps, then throwing fatwood into the stone hearth. Within minutes, a roaring fire cast a warm, golden glow across the room. The girl stood near the door, clutching the buffalo coat, her eyes darting around the room. She saw the hunting rifles mounted on the wall, the heavy iron traps, and the sheer size of her new owner. She was trembling, and Gideon knew it wasn't just from the cold. He pointed to a heavy wooden chair near the fire. "Sit." She obeyed instantly, shrinking into the wood. Gideon walked into the kitchen area, filled a cast-iron kettle with water, and placed it over the fire. He didn't speak to her. He went to a wooden chest, pulled out a stack of clean, oversized flannel shirts and a pair of heavy wool socks, and placed them gently on the table beside her. "The washroom is through that door," Gideon said, pointing. "There's a tub and soap. I'll leave the hot water by the door. Change into those. Throw your rags in the fire." He turned his back to her, giving her privacy, as he began slicing salted pork to cook. An hour later, she emerged. She was wearing Gideon's red flannel shirt, which hung down to her knees like a dress, and the thick wool socks. The soot and grime were washed away, revealing pale, flawless skin, marred only by the fading purple bruises on her cheek and wrists. She sat back by the fire watching him plate a massive portion of roasted pork beans and cornbread. He set the tin plate in front of her, along with a mug of hot black tea. "Eat." She looked at the food, then at him. Slowly she reached out, took a piece of cornbread, and took a bite. A tear slipped down her cheek. Within seconds, she was eating with a ravenous, desperate hunger. Gideon sat across the room, quietly eating his own meal, watching her. When she finally pushed the empty plate away, Gideon spoke. "I don't know your name. I don't speak Chinese. But you need to understand something. You are not a slave here. Tomorrow, when the snow clears, if you want to leave, I'll give you a horse, provisions, and gold, and you can ride to Cheyenne. If you have family, I'll help you find them. Until then, you have the spare room." The girl stared at him. The firelight flickered in her dark eyes. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind screaming against the log walls. Then she opened her mouth. "My name is Cora," she said softly, her voice raspy, but carrying a flawless, educated Western accent. Gideon froze his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. "Josiah said you didn't speak English." "Josiah is an idiot," Cora replied, sitting up a little straighter. "I was raised by missionaries in San Francisco. I read and write English better than the men who put me in chains." Gideon set his cup down, narrowing his eyes. "If you could speak English, why didn't you scream for help in town? Why let them treat you like a dumb animal?" Cora's expression hardened into something sharp and guarded. "Because if they knew who I really was, they wouldn't have sold me at auction. They would have put a bullet in the back of my head." She reached into the pocket of the flannel shirt. From it, she pulled a small, leather-bound ledger. It was stained with dried blood. "I wasn't a camp washerwoman." "Mr. Hayes," Cora said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "I was the chief translator and accountant for the Union Pacific Railroad camps at Bitter Creek. 6 days ago, I watched the camp overseers murder 24 workers in their sleep. They buried them in a mass grave to avoid paying out their year-end wages." Gideon stared at the small book. The gravity of her words settled over the cabin like a suffocating blanket. "Who gave the order?" Gideon asked quietly. "Horace Gentry. Cora said naming the wealthiest, most ruthless railroad baron in the Wyoming Territory. This ledger proves he ordered the massacre. It proves he's been stealing government subsidies, laundering money, and butchering workers for 3 years. I stole it and ran. Gentry's men caught me, but they thought I was just a random camp girl fleeing the violence. They stripped me, beat me, and gave me to Josiah to sell, not realizing what was sewn into the lining of my dress." Cora looked at Gideon, her eyes filled with a terrifying certainty. "They are going to realize who I am, and when they do, Gentry won't just send the sheriff. He will send an army. They will tear this mountain apart to find this book. You need to let me leave tonight, or you are going to die." Gideon sat in silence, looking from the terrified brave girl to the blood-stained ledger. He thought of Jeb Stone's threat. He thought of the corrupt politicians in Cheyenne who danced on Gentry's strings. He thought of the peaceful, quiet life he had built here in the snow, away from the cruelty of the world. Slowly, Gideon stood up. He walked over to the wall, pulled a heavy Winchester repeating rifle from its mount, and racked around into the chamber with a loud metallic clack. He looked out the frost-covered window into the howling blizzard. "Let them come," Gideon said. "It's been a long time since I had company." For 3 days the blizzard trapped them in a suffocating white void. Inside the heavy log walls of the cabin, a quiet, profound shift occurred between the scarred mountain man and the fugitive accountant. Gideon Hayes did not treat Cora like a prize, a servant, or a victim. He treated her like a partner in a war they were both destined to fight. Cora refused to cower in the spare room. She insisted on pulling her weight, taking over the cooking, tending to Gideon's wounds from his labor in the bitter cold, and meticulously organizing the cabin's meager supplies. But most importantly, she asked to learn how to fight. On the second morning, Gideon placed a heavy Colt single-action Army revolver on the pine table. He stood behind her, his massive hands gently guiding her slender fingers over the cold steel, showing her how to cock the hammer and align the iron sights. His chest pressed lightly against her back, his breath warm against her ear. For a man who hadn't touched another human being with tenderness in a decade, the proximity was electrifying. Cora, too, felt a strange, terrifying safety in his shadow. The bruised, traumatized girl who had stood shivering on the auction block was vanishing, replaced by a woman forging herself into iron. "Don't yank the trigger, Cora," Gideon murmured, his deep voice vibrating through her. "Squeeze it, like you're holding a bird you don't want to crush. If Gentry's men come, they won't show mercy. You can't show hesitation." "I won't," she promised, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. She looked up at him, studying the jagged, grisly scar that tore through his beard. She reached up her fingers, grazing the ruined tissue. Gideon stiffened, unused to gentle hands, but he didn't pull away. "Why did you really buy me, Gideon?" she whispered. $3 was a lot for a man who claims he wants to be left alone. Gideon looked down at her, his storm-grey eyes softening. "Because the world is an ugly place, Cora, and for 10 years I've done nothing but hide from it. When I saw you on that block, looking at those animals with so much defiant fire in your eyes, I knew if I let that fire go out, my soul would go with it." By the fourth dawn, the snow finally stopped falling, leaving Ironwood Basin buried under a blinding, sunlit expanse of white. The silence of the mountain was deafening until the distant rhythmic crunch of horse hooves broke it. Gideon was at the window in seconds, a brass spyglass pressed to his eye. Coming up the valley pass, cutting through the deep drifts, was a posse of 15 heavily armed riders. Leading the pack was Clayton Reed, a notorious Pinkerton-turned hired killer on Horace Gentry's payroll. Riding closely beside him, pointing the way, was Jeb Stone, the brothel owner from South Pass City. Jeb had sold out their location for the bounty. "They're here," Gideon said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He tossed the Colt revolver to Cora. She caught it seamlessly, checking the cylinder just as he had taught her. Gideon grabbed his heavy Sharps buffalo rifle and a bandolier of thick brass cartridges. "Stay away from the windows," Gideon ordered, knocking out the glass of a small firing port he had built into the thick front door. "Keep your back to the stone chimney. If they breach the cabin, you empty that gun into the first thing that moves." Outside, the posse fanned out, forming a deadly crescent around the cabin. Clayton Reed spurred his dark gelding forward, pulling a megaphone to his lips. "Gideon Hayes." Clayton's voice echoed off the snow-capped peaks. "We know you have the Chinese girl. Send her out with the book she stole, and we ride away. You have a nice spread here. Hayes, be ashamed to burn it to the ground over a $3 camp whore." Inside, Gideon's jaw locked. He leveled the heavy barrel of the Sharps rifle through the firing port, exhaled a long breath, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared like a cannon. The massive .50 caliber slug tore through the frigid air and struck Clayton Reed's horse squarely in the chest. The beast collapsed instantly, sending Clayton flying face-first into the deep snow. "That's my answer!" Gideon bellowed. Chaos erupted. The 14 remaining riders opened fire simultaneously. A hail of lead shredded the front of the cabin, splintering wood and shattering the remaining windows. Gideon dropped to a knee, quickly reloading the single-shot Sharps. He fired again, taking a man clean out of the saddle. "Light it up!" Clayton screamed, scrambling behind a water trough for cover. "Burn them out!" 3 men dismounted, rushing the cabin with torches and bundles of dynamite. Gideon swapped the sharps for his Winchester repeater, firing rapidly, dropping 2 of the runners in the snow. But the 3rd man made it to the blind spot against the cabin's side wall. Cora heard the scrape of boots against the exterior logs right beside the kitchen window. The man was striking a match to light a stick of dynamite. Without thinking, Cora stepped away from the safety of the stone chimney. She raised the heavy Colt, leveled it at the wooden wall where the sound was coming from, and fired 3 times in rapid succession. The heavy point, .45 caliber bullets punched through the pine chinking. A muffled scream followed, and the man slumped against the window frame, the unlit dynamite rolling into the snow. Gideon looked back at her, a fierce grin breaking through his beard. Good girl. But the numbers were against them. Under the covering fire of the posse, Jeb Stone and 3 heavily armed thugs kicked in the side door to the washroom, swarming into the cabin. The washroom door splintered inward, and the tight confines of the cabin became a slaughterhouse. Gideon swung the butt of his Winchester, crushing the jaw of the first thug through the door. Before the man even hit the floorboards, Gideon drew his hunting knife and buried it into the shoulder of the second, kicking him backward into the snow. But Jeb Stone had slipped past the melee. His grease-stained face twisted in malice. He raised his shotgun, aiming directly at Cora. "Told you she'd die on your floor. Hayes!" Jeb spat. Before Jeb could pull the triggers, Gideon lunged across the room, throwing his massive body between the shotgun and Cora. The twin barrels erupted. The deafening blast shook the cabin, and Gideon was thrown backward, crashing into the heavy oak dining table. A spray of buckshot had caught him in the right side and shoulder, shredding his heavy coat and painting the floor red. "Gideon!" Cora screamed. Jeb laughed, breaking open the shotgun to reload, but he had forgotten about the bruised captive girl he had mocked days ago. Cora didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, leveled the Colt directly at Jeb's chest and pulled the trigger twice. The recoil snapped her wrists back, but the shots were dead center. Jeb's laughter turned into a wet gasp, and he collapsed dead onto the floorboards. Outside, the remaining gunmen saw their men fall. Realizing that the legendary mountain man and his fierce companion were systematically butchering them, the surviving outlaws lost their nerve. They scrambled onto their horses and spurred them down the valley, leaving Clayton Reed bleeding in the snow, abandoning the siege. The silence that followed was agonizing, broken only by the sound of Gideon's heavy, ragged breathing. Cora dropped the gun and rushed to his side, sliding onto her knees in the pool of his blood. "No, no, no, Gideon, stay with me." She wept her hands, pressing desperately against his shredded shoulder, trying to staunch the bleeding. Gideon looked up at her, his face pale, but a faint smile touched his lips. He reached up with his good hand, his blood-stained fingers gently wiping a tear from her cheek. "I ain't dying today, Cora," he rasped. "I finally got something worth living for." For the next 2 months, Cora Hayes became the fierce protector of Ironwood Basin. She meticulously tended to Gideon's wounds, pulling the buckshot from his flesh and nursing him through a brutal fever. While he was bedridden, she strapped his Colt to her hip and managed the ranch. She fed the cattle, chopped the wood, and kept watch. But she didn't just survive. She plotted her revenge. When the spring thaw finally opened the mountain passes in April of 1879, Cora didn't wait for Horace Gentry to send more men. She rode down the mountain herself, straight to the territorial capital of Cheyenne. She bypassed the corrupt local sheriffs and walked directly into the office of United States Marshal Caleb Wyatt, slamming the blood-stained ledger onto his desk. The ledger was a master class in forensic accounting. Cora had detailed every stolen federal dollar, every bribe paid to local judges, and the exact orders Gentry had signed for the massacre of the Bitter Creek camp workers. Marshal Wyatt, an uncompromising veteran of the law, took one look at the books and wired Washington for federal troops. 3 weeks later, Horace Gentry was dragged from his luxurious Cheyenne mansion in iron shackles. His corrupt empire collapsed overnight, his assets seized, and his hired killers scattered to the wind. The Wyoming Territory reeled from the scandal, but in the mountains of Ironwood Basin, peace finally returned. By late summer, Gideon was fully healed, though he carried a new set of scars to match the old. On a warm August afternoon, a black buggy rolled up the long dirt road to the cabin. Out stepped Hiram Finch, the most respected attorney in Cheyenne, holding a leather briefcase. Cora, dressed in a beautiful tailored riding habit, stood on the porch next to Gideon. She frowned, looking up at him. "Who is this Gideon? Are we in trouble?" Gideon didn't answer. He led her inside, motioning for Finch to sit at the newly repaired dining table. Finch opened his briefcase, pulling out a thick stack of legal documents adorned with wax seals. "Mr. Hayes," Finch said, adjusting his spectacles, "I have drafted the documents exactly as you requested. It is highly irregular but perfectly binding under territorial law." Cora looked back and forth between the two men. "What documents?" Gideon picked up a pen, dipped it in ink, and signed the bottom of the heavy parchment. He then turned the paper around and slid it across the table to Cora. Cora's eyes scanned the legal script. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the deed to Ironwood Basin, the thousands of acres of land, the massive herds of cattle, the timber rights, the cabin, everything. Gideon had legally transferred sole ownership of his entire empire to her. "Gideon," Cora whispered, her hands trembling as she held the paper, "I don't understand. Why would you do this? This is your life's work." Gideon stepped close to her, taking her small hands in his massive, calloused ones. He looked deeply into her eyes, stripping away the hardened mountain man, to reveal a man entirely devoted to the woman standing before him. "Because a piece of paper shouldn't dictate a person's worth," Gideon said softly. "But in this world, it dictates their power. You were sold on a block like livestock for $3. Men looked at you and saw nothing but property. I want the world to look at you and see a queen." A tear slipped down Cora's cheek as she looked at the deed, then back to the man who had saved her life. "I bought your life for $3, Cora," Gideon murmured, pulling her close, his lips brushing against her forehead. "But you saved my soul. This land isn't mine anymore. It's yours. And if you'll have me, I'd be honored to work it by your side for the rest of my days." Cora dropped the deed. She threw her arms around Gideon's neck, pulling his face down to hers, kissing him with a fierce, burning passion that washed away the horrors of their past. It was a promise sealed in the quiet wilderness of the Wyoming mountains. History would go on to remember Cora Hayes not as a bruised captive sold in a muddy alleyway, but as the Ironwood Baroness. Together, she and Gideon built the largest, most prosperous cattle ranch in the territory. They were ruthless to their enemies, fiercely loyal to their ranch hands, and utterly devoted to one another. And in the grand foyer of their sprawling, newly built manor, framed in glass above the great stone hearth, sat 3 crumpled, grease-stained dollar bills, a reminder to everyone who entered that the greatest empire in the West wasn't built on gold, but on the unyielding love of a mountain man and the unbreakable spirit of the woman he saved. What began as a brutal display of cruelty turned into a legendary tale of redemption, love, and untamed justice in the Wild West. Gideon and Cora's story proves that sometimes the most priceless treasures in the world are disguised by a few crumpled dollar bills. If this story of the mountain man and his ironwood baroness kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with your fellow history buffs, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true-life tales from the American frontier. Let us know what you thought of Cora's Revenge in the comments below.